We got one more guest, one more segment here for this February 7th edition of Bang the Book Radio. That is with Greg Peterson of the Hoopin with Hoops podcast, also of VSIN. Greg, how's it going today, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Adam. It feels like we just chatted, and ironically enough, we did on my podcast, Hoopin with Hoops.
Yes, sir. We definitely did. We're doing a little bit of a home and home series here for our Friday editions of our shows. So thank you for having me on yours. I appreciate you coming on mine. And before we get into the college basketball stuff here, you and I talked last week. You wound up going out to Iowa for the Super Bowl. Definitely a change of scenery and something different outside of the Nevada sports betting markets. How'd that trip wind up for you?
It wound up being terrific. For one, if you've never been out to Iowa, there is a lot of great Midwest hospitality. The people there were first class and then some, so it was a very good operation. And I was really impressed by the book itself. With Catfish Bend, which is where I was at, they're a PointsBet affiliate, and it was sort of like I guess you could call it mini version of a Las Vegas sports book. They had a couple of slot machines in there. They had a nice little bar area. They had pretty much a little bit of a triangle as well, because you have your main casino where you've got a little bit of everything, much more slots and everything like that. This was just like down a ramp. You walk down, you're able to go to the window, you're able to place some bets there. They have a couple kiosks. So everything was very nice. You had limited seating, but you had some seating along with a bunch of big giant TVs. I was very impressed by the setup. Like I said, not as big as Las Vegas, but it sort of gave you that Las Vegas feel in, I guess you could call it a little bit of a less congested area.
So, I mean, obviously, it's the Super Bowl. I mean, it's the biggest single betting event of the year. And, you're used to what you see out there in Las Vegas as far as the prop catalog, the betting options, all that kind of thing. Was that pretty similar out there in Iowa?
It certainly was. Now, it certainly was not the Westgate where you could bet on, like, the shortest punt of Mr. Wisnowski or anything like that, but they had like 50-plus props out there. They had team to score first half line, second half lines, everything like that. Player prop for yardage. Will this guy score a touchdown or not? So it was pretty standard. Like I said, it's not going to be as extensive yet as some of these books that are just making hand over fist with money, but I did like the selection.
So what did you take away from, a state that's kind of in its infancy with sports betting there in Iowa? I mean, as you mentioned, it's a pretty good operation. It's a nice little area there at the retail sports book. But did you get a chance to talk to anybody about, how sports betting is going over, how how Iowans are embracing it, anything like that?
I actually did. The general manager of Catfish Bend, Rob Higgins, was a person that joined my podcast. What he told me is that he is noticing newer and younger customers that are coming into his casinos. He told me that this has been very good for business, and that is exactly what he wanted to see, because with where I went to, Burlington, Iowa, it is right on the border of Illinois and Iowa. So typically he's going to do a little bit of business with places like Peoria. And if you know where that is, I do salute you. You're probably a Midwesterner. But with that said, just the fact that he is seeing more business and younger business with sports betting is very encouraging for other states to legalize it. He has been very happy with the turnout. He loves the way that the book is set up because, like I said, it's pretty much a mini version of a Las Vegas sports book. And he just, by and large, has been very impressed by things. And Iowa is a state in which does not have a professional sports team. And I thought it was very intriguing that because we thought, hey, it's about 4.5 hours away from Kansas City, it's all going to be Chiefs. That actually was not the case, because what we forgot about is that George Kittle, one of the stars of the San Francisco 49ers, he went to college in nearby Iowa, grew up in the area, and I actually saw on Super Bowl Sunday more 49er fans than Chiefs fans, something that I certainly did not think I would see.
So I know, correct me if I'm wrong, you were a 49ers fan for the game. You did like them a little bit in the Super Bowl. And as we all know, Kansas City does come away with the win and cover there. But other than that, on a personal level, how'd the Super Bowl go for you with props and whatnot?
The props were okay. I had a couple unders on Tyreek Hill. Needless to say, that third down play was bad because I had the San Francisco 49ers on the money line. I had Tyreek Hill under his yardage. If that play doesn't happen, I probably have a very, very profitable Super Bowl. Instead, it sort of went up in a little bit of a heap of smoke, but it's exactly why I say you never bet more than you can afford to lose. It was a little bit of a small loser, but with that said, had I went in larger, I would have been much, much more salty. I just placed a bunch of little bets just because I wanted to get the full Iowa betting experience, and the fact that I got free dinner also helped.
Yeah, it definitely does. And your college basketball season has been anything but a loser. You're having a very good year. Obviously, for people that know you, they know you bet every side and total for every game. People that don't know you, well, if they're listening to the show now, they know that. So you're very busy here on these massive college basketball Saturdays. That will be our focus here. But I always like to talk about a topic with you before we just get into specific game breakdowns. We've got a lot of rivalry games this weekend, and I will pick your brain about some of them specifically. But Greg, as a general rule here, I mean, do you have any deviations from your usual process because it's a rivalry game?
Not really. It's one of these things where I look at every game on a game-by-game basis. I always have my base power rankings, and then I do play into the numbers, just what sort of a crowd that you could expect to get, because it's going to be a little bit more boisterous when you get something like a Duke versus North Carolina game as compared to, let's throw out there a team that has not been in the ACC for very long, Louisville versus Duke. I mean, both teams, very passionate fan bases and everything like that, but there's just a little bit of extra juice whenever you get those rivals. I think a better example would be like Rutgers versus Maryland, a game that we saw a few days ago. Both these teams were not in the Big Ten a few years ago, and they wind up playing against each other. There's just not the same level of energy there as you're going to have for, like, say, Ohio State versus Michigan. So you do have to play that into account. But with that said, the numbers are really the numbers. It's not one of these games in which kids are going to take a game off because they're playing in a team that may not be an arch rival versus one that is one. So you put it in there a little bit, but with that said, you sort of have your evaluations and you try to see if these teams played a little bit before as well, because you always want to factor in, okay, did we have an outlier performance in the first game? Because now we're seeing a lot of return matchups as well.
Now, some of these rivalries, of course, geographic, some of them just because, you develop a rival through conference play and, through the team that is the one that gives you the most trouble, the biggest thorn in your side, or just the closest thing that you have to an equal. So we'll talk about a lot of different rivalry games here. And you mentioned the Big Ten, and let's go ahead and start with one of those. Very early tip-off here on Saturday. Michigan State and Michigan. As we know, Michigan at home once again with a rival. Just lost to one of them on Tuesday in the Ohio State Buckeyes, who have similarly been struggling, much like Michigan has. What do you think about this one in Ann Arbor on Saturday?
I think that this is going to be a fascinating game because keep in mind, last time these two teams played, Michigan went on the road. They got lambasted by double digits. I think that was one of the first games in which they played without Isaiah Livers. I am thinking Isaiah Livers is going to be out for this one, but that is obviously a check and see situation because it feels like half of Michigan's roster, let's be honest here, has been in and out of the fold. It makes it a little bit tougher for handicapping that team, but this is also a Michigan State team that I think we will both agree they have not been as successful on the road as they have been at home. Like we were on this podcast last week talking about, Michigan State really caught a break. Wisconsin no longer has Brad Davison in the game because he's suspended. Kobe King is transferred out. This really plays well for the Spartans, and then go figure, Xavier Tillman can't hit a layup, and they wind up losing to the Wisconsin Badgers, who were shorthanded. So I do think that this is a fascinating case. I do expect Michigan to be an underdog, and if they're an underdog of, I would say, 4 or more points, I certainly would be looking at them because I do sort of have my trepidations with them being on the money line. But if I would have a lean early on, it would be towards Michigan because we've been talking about this quite a bit on this podcast, my podcast. Everyone in just sports gambling is talking about just how hot the Big Ten home teams have been all year long.
Yeah, and again, we are recording this on Thursday evening, so we don't have any lines or anything like that we can discuss. But how worried are you about Michigan State? I mean, we know the Big Ten is the best conference in the country, but that's largely because there are a lot of very good teams. And right now, I don't know if there's necessarily an elite team in this conference, but I look up and down Michigan State's results, and I mean, they just don't force turnovers. They make it really, really difficult on themselves. Seems like that's holding them back quite a bit. Is this the best team in the Big Ten clearly to you, or are you worried about Sparty long term?
That is a tough one because out there in the Big Ten, you could go with a lot of different teams. I hear people making the case for Illinois being the top team out there in the Big Ten. I think that that's a little bit far-fetched just because I don't know if the three-point shooting of the Illini is going to be able to carry them far enough to be able to win a Big Ten title. But with that said, I think that there are some trepidations with Michigan State, and you brought it up. This team ranks in the bottom 35 in all of college basketball with regards to turnovers forced per possession for their opponents. So I do think that is something you got to take a look at. And this is a team that's just really inconsistent with regards to their offense. You've got Cassius Winston. You know what you're going to get from him night to night. Sometimes he has a little bit of an off game, but who around Cassius Winston is really stepping up? Xavier Tillman, who I just mentioned, he had a badly off game against Wisconsin. That probably cost Michigan State a win, and if he's on his game, probably a cover, despite the fact that it was a multiple possession line in regards to the close. So I do think that this is a situation in which you got to be taking a look at Michigan State. You got to think, okay, who's that guy that's going to step up? But you do have to keep this in mind as well. How many times haven't we seen Michigan State flailing around in early Big Ten play or even late in conference play? I still remember the Final Four run that they made in 2015. They wound up losing on their home floor out of conference to something by the name of Texas Southern out there in the SWAC. They wind up making their run. Tom Izzo is just a magician to get his team playing their best basketball at the right time. We saw it last year. So there is a little bit of this and a little bit of that, I guess you could say. So I have my worries with Michigan State, but at the same time, I believe that they have the best coach to get them ramped up at the right time in Tom Izzo.
We'll stay in the Big Ten here. We'll talk about Purdue and Indiana. And I don't know who pissed Purdue off the other night, but 104 points against Iowa.
Over 60 points in the first half.
Running away. Over 1.5 points per possession in that game for Purdue. Now they go on the road and take on Indiana. And Indiana's been very Jekyll and Hyde. I don't think we really know what we're going to get night in and night out. But with this being a rivalry game, we know we're getting the effort. We just don't know if they're going to be able to follow through, take down the win, or even cover the number. First of all, where do you think this number is going to be? And second of all, how do you kind of handicap this matchup?
This is a little bit of a tough one, but this is just one of these situations where Purdue at home has been an absolute juggernaut. They have won over 60% of their games against the spread at home. They have just been absolutely lights out. We remember what they did a few weeks ago against Michigan State, just completely destroyed them, winning that game by nearly 30. When Virginia hit the road and faced off against Purdue at West Lafayette, completely lambasted them. And then when they go on the road, you don't know what you're going to get. I mean, Matt Harms' home and road splits. I invite anyone listening to take a look at them. They're one of the most demonstrative things I've ever seen in my life. This guy is probably a lottery pick at home. On the road, he looks like me at the YMCA. It's absolutely ridiculous. And that is this entire Purdue team. So it's one of these situations in which the way I'm looking at this game right now, Purdue at home, got to be looking at them. Purdue on the road, want absolutely no part of them. And then when you're taking a look at a total, I'm right now leaning towards the under, just because with Indiana, they started out as one of the top teams in all of college basketball with regards to offensive efficiency. When they entered into Christmas, they were in the top 20 with regards to points per possession scored. Ever since, I would say, the beginning of the new year, I believe that they have broken 70 points twice in regulation. I think that one of those was against Nebraska. Another one was that just massive outlier performance against Maryland, in which everyone was hitting threes left, right, and sideways. So this is a spot where the home team should be able to pull this one off, and at the same time, going to be looking at it under just with the way that Indiana has been playing overall.
All right, let's slide out to the SEC here for a minute. Take a look at Kentucky and Tennessee, another early tip-off here on Saturday. But Tennessee stops the bleeding a little bit, gets that 1-point win over Alabama in a game where they were 2 for 18 from 3. So maybe a little bit of some good feelings, I guess, for Tennessee to not shoot very well, still find a way to win the game. Kentucky, I mean, look, as a blue blood, they haven't been very impressive this season either. How do you sort of handicap this one in Knoxville on Saturday?
I've got to be taking a look at Kentucky in this spot, just because with Kentucky, you've got so many guys that do such a good job down low for this team. And keep in mind, the rough start that Kentucky got off to in the non-conference, a lot of that was due to injury. You had E.J. Montgomery and Nate Sestina miss some time. When Nate Sestina came back, he made an immediate impact for this team. Those two guys, along with Nick Richards, combined for right around 19 to 20 rebounds per game. And this is a Tennessee bunch that ever since Lamont Turner got out of the fold, it's just been really interesting to gauge this team. They've been able to pull off a couple of covers, but with that said, the offense just has not been able to get out of neutral. You do have Santiago Vescovi, the gentleman that comes in from Uruguay. He's been able to give the team right around 9 to 10 points per game. He's able to bury a couple triples, but I just have absolutely no faith in this backcourt whatsoever. And for Kentucky, what you've got to like is the fact that Emmanuel Quickly has been able to step up, shooting 40% from three. The biggest kryptonite that I had with regards to the Wildcats this season was just the three-point shooting. He seems to be giving them some stabilization because Tyrese Maxey, after a hot start to the year, he wound up fading off, but Quickly has, I guess, for lack of a better term, quickly been able to resolve that. I just think that this is a spot in which Kentucky is going to be a short favorite, and I would look to lay it here. I typically don't like taking short favorites, especially in conference games, but Kentucky has proven time and time again that they're able to do it. And I would argue that a few weeks ago, when John Calipari got thrown out of that game against Arkansas, was a rallying cry for this bunch, and they've been playing some inspired basketball ever since then.
It's kind of been a running joke on our show to sort of kick Rick Barnes around, dating back to his days at Texas, where, some of his teams were okay, but, a lot of early tournament exits. Last year, he does get Tennessee to the Sweet 16, but not a guy that we've had collectively a very high opinion of here on Bang the Book Radio. What do you think about Tennessee long term? I mean, they really haven't gotten into any sort of run where they've played consistently well for any long period of time. I mean, is this a team that's ticketed for the NIT?
I think this year they certainly are. I would say that the job overall that Rick Barnes has done over his entire tenure at Tennessee, he's been doing a very good job. Keep in mind, Tennessee, the previous 2 years when they had all of their players in there, Admiral Schofield and company, that was a homegrown bunch that wound up being able to make some Sweet 16s. They wound up being a top 3 seed in the NCAA tournament in back-to-back years. So I'm very impressed with what Rick Barnes has done overall. And I did think that Tennessee was coming into the year with a little bit too much fanfare because, like I mentioned, they just had lost way too many pieces with Lamont Turner, their main point guard, being out of the fold. That just completely destroyed the team because we saw with him in the fold, this team was able to take down a Washington team. Speaking of a team that is currently dealing with some losses, that would be Washington, but they looked very impressive in that game. So I don't think that we can pin it all on Rick Barnes, but with that said, unless if Tennessee is able to pull off some big wins here towards the stretch run, they probably are looking at the three-letter tournament.
Well, you teased the Pac-12 a little bit there, so I think it's a good segue to go over and talk about that a little bit. They call it the Civil War on the football side. I don't know what they call it on the college basketball side, but
I used to work for the official affiliate of Oregon Athletics. It's just a Civil War.
All right, fair enough. So we got the Civil War on the hardwood here with Oregon and Oregon State, and Oregon State's lost 5 of 6. I mean, it's not that they've necessarily played bad in all of those games, but they haven't played particularly good either, in particular on the offensive side. What do you think this one looks like here with the Ducks coming to Corvallis?
I think that this is going to be a game in which I'm hoping that it's going to be a little bit of a shorter line because Oregon has been doing a good job of being able to get the job done in a lot of their games, since that game against Colorado, which they just never win at Colorado. Ever since Colorado joined the Pac-12, before it was the Pac-10, before they joined, they have never won a game at the CU Event Center. So I saw that coming. Now, the loss on the road against Washington State, that was a little bit of an eye-opener. It was the first top 10 win for Washington State since before the era of Klay Thompson. So that tells you that it had been a while. But with that said, what we've been noticing with Oregon is that they've just been laying a couple too many points on the road. And for Oregon State, this is a team that really lacks depth. They're only going to go about 6 deep, but those 6 players are very good. You've got a guy like an Ethan Thompson. He's going to give you about 14 to 15 points per game, 5 assists, and then you got Trace Tinkle. The guy's a little bit of a matrix in that he fills up every stat of the box score, right around 20 points. He'll pull down 7 rebounds, shoots 40% from 3. He'll give you a block. He'll give you a steal. But what I think is going to be big for Oregon is just being able to drive into the painted area, because what Oregon State has is one of the top shot blockers among all Power 5 conference teams in Kyler Kelly. He's been able to give the team right around 4 blocks per game. If Oregon is able to find a way to drive inside, that means that they're going to open up lanes to be able to shoot those threes. And with Oregon, this is a top 25 team with regards to three-point shooting percentage. When we think Oregon, we typically think about that slow, grimy style that they were able to get to the Sweet 16 with last year. They've actually been kicking it up tempo, has been one of the best over teams in all of college basketball. If Oregon is able to establish that tempo and they're able to get a couple drives to the rim, I think it's going to play very well for this Ducks team.
So Oregon here, I mean, they got a shot at a very nice road win, and we'll see if they wind up getting it. But right now, according to most of the metric sites that are out there, Oregon does trail Arizona and Colorado, and in some places by a relatively substantial margin in terms of their overall rank. Who is the best team in the Pac-12 to you?
I would still have to go with Oregon. And I just think that Arizona is a team that's a little bit too inconsistent. We saw it in the non-conference slate. They wind up losing to St. John's. They wind up losing to Baylor. They have their trouble on the road. Now, they fought admirably against Oregon when they went on the road, but that was still a game in which they just weren't able to close it out, and that has really been the issue for Arizona. They don't have that experience. Meanwhile, Oregon, they've got a point guard that has started in the Final Four in Peyton Pritchard. Feels like this guy has been on campus for forever, because I was working for Oregon Athletics a little bit over 3 years ago. He was a team starting point guard back then. I mean, this guy is probably going for his doctorate at this point. He's been on campus for that long, but that's a good thing. And what I also think for Oregon is that they've got the best coach in all of college basketball, because John Beilein is no longer at the college level, in Dana Altman. Dana Altman just does a great job of getting his team to fire on all cylinders in March. We saw it when they made the Final Four a few years ago. We saw it when they made their Sweet 16 run last year. I still have to go with Oregon being the top team in this conference.
All right, so here's a rivalry game that, I don't know, people may have heard of, I guess, and this one's coming up here on Saturday. Duke and North Carolina. Maybe you've heard of this game, maybe you haven't. North Carolina does have Cole Anthony back now, so we would hope that they would start to look like a little bit of a different team. Obviously, the damage done at 10-12. They're not going to the NCAA tournament unless something absolutely insane happens. What about this weekend, though? You know, you can kind of save the season a little bit to a degree. It is a throwaway year, but you can kind of save it a little bit if you're able to take at least one of these games against Duke, but there'll be a big underdog here to do it this weekend.
Oh, yeah, and I'm probably going to be looking at the points here with North Carolina. I am expecting them to be a massive dog, and this is one of these games in which there's always just a little bit more juice for it. The players, they work for this all year long. And I will say this about North Carolina. They've went 0-2 ever since Cole Anthony has returned to the fold. But without Cole Anthony, those 10 or so games that he was out, team was giving up an average of about 74.5 to 75 points per game, give or take a little bit. With Cole Anthony in the fold, this team has not allowed more than 74 points all year long. They do a better job of being able to play on defense. Big reason why Cole Anthony is able to force about 2 steals per game. Trey Jones is pretty good with the ball, but he can sometimes have his turnover woes. We've got a Duke team as well that they don't have quite the talent that they did last year, just with regards to those starting three, because obviously when you got Zion Williamson, Cam Reddish, and RJ Barrett, that's a prolific trio. But I would actually argue that this team is a little bit better because they're a little bit more of a cohesive unit. They had absolutely no bench last year. They had no three-point shooting. Coach K really didn't do a whole lot of in-game adjusting because he's like, all right, I've got the best 3 players out there on the floor. You guys just go take care of it. He realizes this year he doesn't have it. So he's getting guys like Matthew Hurt into these good situations. He's gotten the most out of Vernon Carey. I think that this is a much better job by Coach K with regards to coaching than it was last year. But with that said, I don't know if it's going to be enough to be able to cover a big spread here against North Carolina. I feel like this North Carolina team is rejuvenated. And one thing that has never left North Carolina is the fact that they do a good job down low. Garrison Brooks, Armando Bacot, these two guys are able to give the team quite a few rebounds. I think that as long as North Carolina is able to play even up on the glass, which I expect them to, they're going to be able to hold at bay.
Now, as I mentioned, a lot of these rivalries generally come about because these teams are close and you've got, divided families, divided cities, all that kind of thing. This is a rivalry game. It's not because they're close. It's just because of the recent history between these two programs, Gonzaga and St. Mary's. And Gonzaga, I mean, look, they're not going to be tested much the rest of the way until they get to the NCAA tournament. BYU, probably the second best team in this league. They beat them by 23 at home. What do you think happens here when they go on the road to take on St. Mary's Saturday night?
I think this is going to be fascinating because you've got 2 of the top 15 teams in all of college basketball with regards to offensive efficiency. You've got a St. Mary's team that they look to play it actually a little bit slower, despite the fact that St. Mary's has been a good over team all year long. This is still a team that, with regards to a possessions per game standpoint, they're in the bottom 50 in the country. With Gonzaga, this is a team that they're able to play at warp speed if they want to. I think a big key for Gonzaga is, will Killian Tilly play in this game or not? He wound up getting hurt in the team's game against Santa Clara about a week and a half ago. He wound up missing the game against San Francisco. on last Saturday as a result. This guy's a difference maker. At his full forces 2 years ago, he was able to shoot 48% from three. When you got a guy that's at 6'10" and he's able to bury triples like that, that is a complete game changer. But even without him, you got a guy in Ryan Woolridge, shoots 45% from three, does a good job with an assist to turnover ratio of 3. And what I think is key for this St. Mary's team is just being able to get themselves going early, because if they go into chase mode, this is a team that they don't necessarily play very fast, and that is really going to put them behind the 8 ball. And we see what Gonzaga is able to do when they get off to an early start. They're able to just completely destroy teams, and it's just one of these things in which you got to feel like St. Mary's is going to be a little bit juiced up for this game, because they know how many times Gonzaga has taken them down. But keep in mind, last year, Gonzaga wound up losing in that West Coast tournament to St. Mary's, and I think that there's going to be a little bit of added juice with that as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask you, because I know we talked about revenge situations on your show, the Hoopin' with Hoops podcast. That's what I was going to ask you is, do you feel like there's year-over-year carryover when you play against the team that knocked you out of your conference tournament?
Well, it has to depend. Like, for Kentucky, there's not going to be a whole lot of it because, well, nobody was there last year. So there's that along with Duke. But when you have a team like a Gonzaga, a bunch of guys that typically stay for multiple years, you've got a bunch of grizzled veterans. I know that they only have one starter that returns from last year, but you got to think that that's going to be on their mind. And for St. Mary's, pretty much everyone is back from last year. So I think it's one of these depends on the situation sort of thing. With these mid-major teams, absolutely. With a team like Duke, not so much.
One more game I want to ask you about here, and this one comes from what I guess I'd call probably my favorite mid-major conference. Maybe it's a low-major conference. It depends on, I guess your view may vary, but the CAA. There are a lot of good teams in this league. I don't think there's a great team, but there are a lot of good teams, and a couple of those good teams meet here this weekend, Northeastern and Hofstra. And this is a fascinating game because Hofstra kind of caught a second wind here. They blew out William and Mary last Saturday, avenging a loss from earlier on in the season. Northeastern lost to Hofstra at home earlier on in the year, so you've got the home revenge factor here for Northeastern. Hofstra's playing better. Northeastern is not. What do you think about this game?
This is really interesting because you've got two teams that are able to go bombs away from three-point range. Jordan Rowland got off to a ridiculous start this year. Still averaging about 22 points per game, but he's tailed off a little bit. What I think is going to be key is bold embrace down low for Northeastern. Can he match up with a guy like an Isaac Kanate who has a little bit more size? Kanate is able to give the team 7 rebounds per game. And then with Hofstra, Tariq Coburn, 7 rebounds per game. He's able to launch some threes. But what I really like about Hofstra is that they don't just have 1 or 2 guys that are able to shoot it from 3. They've just got a whole bunch of guys. I mentioned Coburn. How about Eli Pemberton, 15 points per game? We've seen him take over a lot of these games. Hofstra, with regards to their road record, one of the best in all of college basketball over the last 2 years at being able to cover on the road. At home, they have been a stalwart as well. With Northeastern, they try to slow games down a little bit more. Hofstra, they try to speed them up. And Hofstra is often able to get their style because they just seem to be able to turn that on at any point. I remember watching a game with them playing Towson at the beginning of the new year. Towson was able to do a good job of holding them down early, but then you just saw Desir Boye, the point guard of this point guard who shoots 42% from three-point range. He was able to go off, and this is a Hofstra team that they're able to put up 10 points on the board in a flash, and I think that that's a luxury that Northeastern does not have, and for that reason, I've got to be taking a look at the pride in this spot as they've really developed themselves over the last 2 years as, in my opinion, being the best team in this conference.
This is such an interesting conference, and, I'm not exactly sure where these teams are going to fall from a bracketology standpoint, but I got to say, whichever team comes out of the CAA, I don't think I'm going to be real excited to play them if, they are your 3-14 matchup or, maybe if they happen to get a 4-13, something like that. I don't think as a major conference team, I'd be excited to play any of the top teams in this conference.
No, not at all, because the tag team of William and Mary, when you bet on them, you don't just get one of them, you get both of them. But what else you get both of? How about Andy Van Vliet and Chris Knight? 2 guys that stand 6 for 10 or greater. They both shoot in the mid to high 30s from three-point range, and they both pull in 9+ rebounds per game. I think that they are one of just 2 duos in college basketball that both individually average 9+ rebounds apiece. We went through Hofstra and all the three-point shooting that they have. With Northeastern, you got Tyson Walker that's been able to step up for this team. You don't necessarily have a lot of size, but you've got a lot of three-point shooting. And heck, even Towson, Brian Fobbs is a guy that's able to give you 15.5 points per game. Dennis Tunsil along with N.K. Sanders both give you a little bit of facilitation. This is a team that has emerged, and they've been playing a little bit of better basketball. I'm right there with you. The CAA maybe isn't quite what the SoCon was last year, because I felt like the SoCon had a legitimate chance at multiple NCAA tournament bids, but much like the SoCon last year, they've got 4 very solid teams that if any of these 4 make the NCAA tournament, they're going to be a tough out.
And Grant Riller at Charleston's a pretty good player, too. So
Grant Riller is a thriller.
There you go. A lot of talent in the CAA. Going to be a very exciting conference tournament, which, conference tournaments now less than a month away. I think the first conference tournaments start March 3rd. So we're hitting the stretch run here of the college basketball regular season. And, of course, no show does it better than the Hoopin' with Hoops podcast with Greg Peterson. You're also on VSIN pretty regularly. How can people find all your work, man?
And speaking of VSIN, I will be hosting the Green Zone from 2 to 6 p.m. Pacific. With regards to Eastern time, that is 5 to 9 on Saturdays. So all of your college basketball action, in-game opportunities, what have you, I'll be following them all along there. And with regards to the Hoopin' with Hoop podcast, as you mentioned, I break down every single game, every single day. You're my guest on today's podcast, so that is a lot of fun talking about today's slates, what we've seen in conference and everything like that. And you can find that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, wherever you find podcasts. You're able to get that. And the hub for everything that I do with regards to my podcast, my appearances on different radio shows, including your fine show, everything like that, at @GUnit_81 on Twitter.
Always great to chat with Greg Peterson. Again, Hoopin' with Hoops is the podcast. VSIN is the network, at @GUnit_81 on Twitter. Greg, always a pleasure, man. Thank you so much for joining me. We'll talk to you again next week.
Adam, always love doing it. Thank you.